This is a restricted area, sir. Military funeral, 4-star general, no clearance, no entry. Could this old man's presence change everything? The guard barely looked at him, just another old man in a faded uniform, out of place, out of time. He didn't argue, just stood quietly holding a wilted flower inside the gates. Cameras flashed, medals gleamed, flags rose for a national hero. No one noticed the man outside, no one except the general, who stopped the entire ceremony just to walk out and salute him. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The sky over Quantico, Virginia, was the kind of soft gray that made everything feel hushed. It was early fall, and the trees along the hills were just beginning to rust with color. A light wind stirred the American flags, lining the path toward the cemetery gates, their edges fluttering like whispers. Inside the National Cemetery, hundreds of military officials, soldiers, and dignitaries had gathered, their uniforms crisp, shoes polished, faces solemn. Today was not just any burial, it was the funeral of General Marcus R. Connors, a 4-star general who once led U.S. tour special operations across multiple continents. He was a man decorated with every honor the nation could give, and his state funeral had drawn an audience reserved for heroes of the highest order. Security was airtight, names were checked twice, ID badges gleamed under scanners. No one was admitted without clearance, not even former officers, not even retirees, not even Franklin Hayes. At the far edge of the gate, under the rising sun, a man stood. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his uniform old but immaculately pressed. The deep green fabric had faded to something closer to gray-blue over the years, and the brass buttons had lost their shine, but the stitching was tight, the boots polished, the hat tilted just right. Franklin Hayes didn't wear any medals, just a single unit patch on his shoulder, and in his hand a single white lily wrapped carefully in a strip of cloth. He had taken the bus that morning, 5 hours from Roanoke, a transfer in Richmond, then a final stretch in a local line that dropped him at a bench 3/4 of a mile from the entrance. He hadn't asked for a ride, he hadn't called ahead, he had simply come to say goodbye. Franklin approached the gate slowly, one step, then another, until the security officer, a young sergeant in pressed blues, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, sir, this area is restricted for the private funeral service. Do you have clearance?" Franklin blinked, his eyes were pale blue, cloudy around the edges, but still steady. "No," he said quietly, "I just came to pay respects." The guard frowned. "We have a list of authorized guests. Are you family?" Franklin shook his head. "I served with him," he said simply, "a long time ago." The guard looked him over, his wrinkled hands, his worn shoes, his lily. "I'm sorry, sir, without credentials, we can't let you in." Franklin didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't protest. He simply nodded once and stepped aside, taking a place near the outer wall, and there he stood. The breeze tugged at his sleeve. He didn't move. Inside the ceremony began. Rows of generals, foreign dignitaries, the Secretary of Defense, the folded flag, the low hum of bagpipes, taps playing in the distance. But outside the gate, Franklin Hayes stood alone, the flower trembling slightly in his hand, not angry, not bitter, just waiting. Could this quiet vigil spark a moment of recognition? He didn't know that behind the security line, someone had noticed. It was Colonel Logan Marks, one of General Connors' former aides, who spotted the man through the iron bars. The uniform struck him first, then the patch on the shoulder, a unit insignia from Vietnam, Reconnaissance Battalion, Ghost Company, a group that hadn't officially existed for over 50 years. Logan frowned and leaned closer, his eyes narrowed. It couldn't be, but there he was, Franklin Hayes, the man his commander had once said saved his life twice. Logan turned to the 4-star general standing beside the casket. "Sir," he whispered. "He's here." The general turned. "Who, Hayes?" And just like that, everything stopped. General Michael Thurman didn't hesitate. He handed off his ceremonial saber, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and walked briskly, deliberately toward the gates. The honor guard paused, the musicians stopped, even the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as the general reached the outer boundary of the cemetery and opened the gate himself. He stepped outside. Franklin, who hadn't moved in over half an hour, looked up in surprise. General Thurman came to a stop less than 3 feet away and stood at full attention. Then in front of everyone, before the press, the soldiers, the politicians, he saluted, a sharp, clean motion, the kind reserved for equals. "Sir," the general said, his voice thick with emotion, "we've been waiting for you." Franklin blinked, confused. "You don't have to." But the general interrupted, "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes." "Yes, I do." He turned to his aide and extended his hand. The colonel stepped forward holding a polished wooden box, and in front of the silent crowd, the general handed the box to Franklin himself. "The ashes of General Marcus R. Connors. General Connors requested you deliver him home," the general said to his brothers, to the men who were never named in the press, but who saved lives no one ever knew about. Franklin stared down at the box, his hand trembled. "I thought they forgot," he said softly. The general's voice broke. "We didn't." And behind them, in the cemetery's inner circle, the remaining veterans of Ghost Company, now in their 70s and 80s, rose from their chairs. They stood at attention one by one, forming a line at the far edge of the ceremony, and as Franklin Hayes walked through the gates carrying the remains of his fallen friend, each one saluted him, not because they had to, but because they remembered. Could this salute honor a forgotten bond? Because some debts are too deep for medals, too sacred for protocol, and because heroes, real heroes, don't wear ribbons on their chest, they carry them in silence until someone remembers to say, "Welcome home." The wind shifted as Franklin Hayes crossed the threshold. With the weight of a life held quietly, he stepped onto the sacred grass of Quantico National Cemetery, carrying the ashes of the man whose name filled every headline that morning and whose life Franklin had once saved in silence. The general walked beside him, saying nothing. There were no cameras here now, no microphones, just footsteps on gravel and the slow murmur of uniforms adjusting as senior officers stood at attention, not for a four-star general, but for a man they'd never heard of. Franklin stopped short of the service canopy, and in that pause, amid the quiet reverence of a full military funeral, his mind pulled backward. 57 years ago, February 1968, Kisan Combat Base, they called it a siege. 77 days of shelling, bunkers collapsing, nights where you couldn't tell smoke from fog. Franklin was already deep into his second tour when Kisan hit. He was a sergeant by then, 29, older than most of the boys around him, but young enough to still move fast under fire. That night, it was day 34 of the siege. He'd been on perimeter duty when the mortars started falling again. 2 platoons away, fire lit up the sky. He heard the crack of gunfire near the runway, followed by voices screaming over the comms. "This is line Connors, my comm guys hit. We're outside the wire, taking fire from the tree line." Franklin didn't wait, didn't call it in. He grabbed 2 smokes, clipped a flare to his vest, and ran. No cover, no backup, just instinct. He found them crouched behind a half-toppled barrel shack, one man bleeding from the arm, the other shielding him with a pistol and not much else. That second man, Lieutenant Andrew Price, fresh out of West Point, shaken but still shouting orders like someone who didn't know better, and beside him, Connors, face scratched, ankle likely busted, still trying to drag his radio pack with one hand. "You boys lost your map," Franklin had muttered, dropping smoke between them and the trees. "Who the hell are you?" Price had asked. Franklin didn't answer, just grabbed both by their jackets and moved. Tracers hissed through the smoke, the jungle lit up behind them. By the time he threw them over the last wire fence, Franklin was bleeding from a gash across the shoulder. He didn't even notice. He received a citation for valor, never claimed it. He refused the medal, declined the formal commendation, didn't stand for photos. "I just did what I was supposed to," he said when pressed, and then after his final tour. Franklin Hayes did what few men of his kind ever did. He disappeared. Back at Quantico, present day, the letter from Marcus Connors sat heavy in his coat pocket, the last words from a man who had spent decades on podiums commanding battalions, shaping war strategy, and who had never once stopped remembering a single night in a field of mud where everything had almost ended before it began. Franklin's fingers brushed against the envelope as the crowd began to shift. Could this letter reveal a hidden truth? The formal reception was starting. Guests were being ushered toward the white tent at the far side of the field. Uniformed aides passed out program cards and flags folded with perfect symmetry. Franklin remained behind. He didn't belong in reception lines, never had. He stood under a cluster of sycamore trees just off the main path, alone, watching until a voice cut softly into the quiet. "Excuse me, sir." Franklin turned. A young lieutenant stood in front of him, clipboard in hand, polished shoes, stiff collar, probably not a day over 23. "I noticed you weren't on the roster," he said, glancing nervously down at his sheet. "Are you with the family?" Franklin shook his head once. "No press, no military attachment." A pause, then Franklin spoke low and even. "3rd Recon Battalion, Charlie Company, Kisan 1968. The lieutenant blinked. I'm sorry, sir, that's not." "It wouldn't be," Franklin said gently. He didn't offer credentials, didn't elaborate, just nodded once. "I'm not here for the program." The young officer hesitated, then stepped back, uncertain. I'll check with my CO." He turned and moved off quickly. Franklin exhaled and returned his gaze to the horizon, to the rows of flags fluttering just behind the marble columns. The urn still sat on the pedestal under the canopy, untouched, waiting. Across the field, another officer had seen the exchange, a captain, mid-40s, steady eyes, bronze star on his chest. He had noticed the man in the faded green jacket standing alone, and had also noticed the 4-star general, Andrew Price, glancing that same direction twice. The captain moved swiftly, reached the young lieutenant, and spoke quietly. "What's the situation?" "There's an older man near the tree line, says he served in recon at Kisan, but he's not on any list." The captain turned to look. Recognition crossed his face before he even finished the glance. He didn't say a word. He just walked straight toward the command tent. 10 minutes later, a ripple passed through the reception. It started with a whisper from the tent flap, then a movement from the security detail, then the unmistakable shift in posture from the highest-ranking officers present. "Because the Four-star general had just stepped out of the tent, not through the back, not escorted. He walked calmly, deliberately, down the center aisle, flanked by no one. He wasn't heading toward the reception, he was walking toward the gate, toward the man in the faded uniform. Franklin didn't move as the figure approached, but something in the air changed. Whispers broke out among the guests, some lifted phones, hesitating, others simply stood, unsure, and then General Andrew Price removed his gloves and saluted, one clean motion, to the man who once carried him through fire. Could this salute rewrite a forgotten history? The wind carried a stillness through the cemetery, the kind that made you lower your voice without thinking, the kind that wrapped around your shoulders like an invisible weight. Under the tall oaks of Quantico, the crowd had begun to settle, chairs filled with high-ranking officers, rows of dress uniforms lined in symmetry, families seated front and center, faces solemn, some with dark glasses to hide the tears. The casket had not yet arrived at the platform. Everything waited on cue, and at the far edge of it all, near the gates that separated the world of ceremony from the world of silence, Franklin Hayes stood alone, still, the flower long wilted in his hand, the envelope from Connors now folded inside the inner pocket of his jacket, close to the heart he'd guarded for over half a century. He wasn't expecting more, he wasn't waiting for recognition, he was just there, a living relic in a forgotten uniform. And then the silence was broken. A low, steady hum began to grow in the distance. Engines, big ones, heads turned, security stiffened. Then through the tree line, a convoy emerged, 3 military vehicles, matte black, official markings, escort flags fluttering at the corners, and in the middle, a long ceremonial limousine, polished to air's gleam. The entire crowd stood as the vehicles rolled onto the grass, slow and precise, stopping just shy of the main procession. The driver's door opened first, then, with a practiced movement, the rear passenger door swung wide and out stepped General Andrew L. Price, dressed not in standard fatigues, but in full ceremonial uniform, dark blue, gold braid, white gloves, sword at his side. He wore no sunglasses, no expression of pageantry, only focus, only intention. The press adjusted their cameras, the crowd instinctively made space. But General Price did not walk toward the casket, he didn't glance at the podium, he didn't take his place in the front row. Instead, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked away from the formation, straight across the open green, toward the gate, toward Franklin. Murmurs rippled like wind through dry grass. Who is that? Where is he going? Why isn't he? But the questions died as they saw what happened next. Price reached the gate, stopped, and in one fluid motion, he removed his white gloves. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his temple and saluted, to a man standing outside the gates, to a man wearing a uniform no one remembered, to Franklin Hayes. The salute held, and when his arm dropped, Price took one step forward, then another, until he stood face to face with the man who had saved him 54 years earlier. They didn't speak right away. The general's voice, and when it came, was low, unshaken. I told Marcus I'd find you again, he said. He never stopped looking, and when he knew time was running out, he left one last instruction. Franklin said nothing, just looked at the man, no longer the young lieutenant crawling through jungle mud, but someone who had carried a different weight ever since. Price nodded toward the convoy. I brought him here, he said, but only you can bring him home. He gestured to an aide who stepped forward with a polished wooden box, the urn, the remains of General Marcus Connors, and in full view of the nation's highest brass, the Secretary of Defense, and half the Pentagon. General Andrew Price handed the ashes to Franklin Hayes. Camera shutters clicked, but Price raised a hand, stopping them cold. Then he turned back to the crowd, now stunned into a reverent hush. He stepped up onto the low stone riser, took the mic meant for the eulogy, and spoke directly. No speech, no script, just truth. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice steady, carrying across the field. There are moments in military life that live far beyond the battlefield, moments that define who we are, not by the medals we wear, but by the debts we never forget. He paused, then turned, extending a hand toward Franklin, who now stood just behind him. If not for this man, Price continued, Marcus Connors would not have lived past 19, I would not have survived my first command, and everything we've built, every soldier trained, every mission fulfilled would never have happened. Franklin's eyes were on the ground, his hands held the box with the steadiness of a man carrying far more than ashes. Price took a breath. If there is one person, he said, voice now thick with emotion, who deserves to lead this final walk, it is Sergeant Franklin Hayes. Ghost Recon Laos 1971. The stillness cracked, first with a single handclap, then another, then rising slowly, respectfully as the entire assembly came to their feet. One by one, soldiers, generals, and civilians rose and saluted. Dozens of hats lifted, tears wiped quietly, and the press, they put down their cameras, because sometimes you don't capture a moment, you just let it stand. General Price turned, his voice now soft again. Will you walk with me? Sergeant Franklin hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. Together, shoulder to shoulder, they began the walk toward the flag-draped platform, past the stunned officers, past the journalists, past the wreaths and flags, and as they reached the final row, The honor guard parted without a word, letting them pass. Franklin stepped onto the stage and placed the urn down right above the folded flag, not because it was protocol, but because it was right, because some men don't need medals pinned to their chest to be remembered, they just need one person to stand up and say, "I never forgot you." The final notes of taps faded into the wind, no applause followed, no anthem, just silence, the kind of silence that means something, that holds a weight words can't carry. Franklin Hayes stood motionless beside the pedestal, his hand resting on the urn that held the remains of the only man who ever called him brother in arms, even after stars filled his shoulders. Then slowly, at a gesture from General Price, Franklin lifted the box once more and turned. The soldiers lining the path stood rigid in full dress on either side of the walkway. Marines, Navy, Air Force, Army, young and old, rose to full attention. Some saluted sharp and strong, others with hands that trembled, but all of them stood tall as Franklin began the walk down the central aisle of the service, holding Connors' remains with quiet reverence. They didn't move, they saluted him, not the urn, him, and it spread beyond the front row. Veterans in civilian clothes stood beside their canes. Old men with patches on jackets raised their shaky arms. Some removed their hats with tears tracking down their cheeks. It wasn't protocol, it was something else, a kind of remembering this world forgets too easily, a recognition not of medals earned, but of burdens carried. Could this tribute reshape a nation's memory? By the time Franklin reached the family section, the entire cemetery had risen, all the cameras were lowered, all the whispers had stopped. And in the absolute stillness of that moment, surrounded by rank and title and brass, he was the most honored man on that field. He didn't bow, didn't cry, he just walked one step at a time, the final steps of a journey that began in the mud of Laos and ended in the heart of a grateful nation. Later, long after the last guest had gone, after the officers had returned to their cars and the folding chairs were stacked, Franklin remained. He stood beneath the tall oaks at the gravesite, where the ashes had been interred beside a headstone bearing one simple inscription, Jen Marcus, or Connor's brother, commander, friend. Franklin knelt slowly, the stiffness in his knees reminding him that time had not stood still. He lit a small stick of incense, something only he carried in his pocket. The smoke curled into the autumn air, soft and slow. He didn't speak loudly, but if anyone had stood close enough, they might have heard a few words carried on the breeze. "I told you I'd make it." A pause. "You always did hate flowers." Then after a long breath, "Rest easy, kid." He bowed his head once, and when he stood again, he didn't turn to leave because someone was already there waiting just behind him. General Price, still in full dress, though the weight of the day sat heavy on his shoulders now. He held out an envelope smaller than the one before, handwritten, the edges yellowed with time. Franklin looked at it with caution. "What's this?" Price's voice was low. "It was in Connors' safe. He left instructions to give it to you, only if you came all the way to the grave." Franklin took it. The paper crackled under his fingers as he opened it. Inside one paragraph, and it read like it had taken years to write. "Frank, you never let me thank you. Not really. You saved my life and disappeared like it didn't matter, but it mattered to me. You're the only debt I carried that no medal, no command, no ceremony could repay. You let me live long enough to serve, long enough to lead, long enough to die at peace, and if there's any justice in this world, one day they'll say my name beside yours, and maybe then I'll finally feel worthy. Your friend, me." Franklin's hands lowered. He folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into his jacket. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I know," Price replied, "that's why you deserve it." 1 year later, the ribbon cut clean across the stone archway as the crowd applauded. Dozens of veterans gathered under the spring sun. Local officials, reporters, the color guard. Beneath the new sign etched in bronze, the Franklin Hayes Center, a home for healing, a place for those who remember. It was more than a building, it was a sanctuary, a rehabilitation center for veterans returning with wounds that didn't always show, PTSD counseling, physical therapy, woodworking shops, and a quiet memorial garden lined with names not found in textbooks, funded by the Marcus Connors Legacy Foundation, approved by General Andrew Price himself. And right now, the crowd waited for one more thing, a speech, a word from the man whose name was carved into the stone above the door. But Franklin Hayes wasn't on the stage. He was standing off to the side at the edge of the crowd, a dark coat over his shoulders, hands behind his back, and in one hand a single white lily, its petals curled, its color faded, but he held it like it mattered, because it did. No cameras turned toward him, no one shoved a microphone in his face. Only a few who knew, nodded in quiet recognition. He didn't wave, didn't bow, didn't say a word. He just watched the center open, watched young veterans step through its doors for the first time, watched a place rise from quiet service, not fame, and for once that was enough. As the crowd began to thin and the speeches gave way to conversation, General Price walked over quietly. Franklin saw him coming and gave a small nod. They stood side by side for a while, watching the building they both carried in different ways into being. "I told you I didn't want a building," Franklin muttered. Price grinned faintly. "It's not a building." Franklin arched a brow. "It's a thank you," Price said, "etched in stone, for every man who gave more than he got." Franklin looked down at the lily, then back at the doors. "You think they'll come?" Price followed his gaze. They already have. The sun dipped behind the trees as Franklin turned to leave. He walked alone, quietly, the way he always had. But something had changed, not in him, in the world around him. People watched now with respect, not curiosity. They didn't salute him out loud, but in their hearts they remembered, because somewhere in America, one old man in a worn uniform still carried the debts no one could see, and thanks to one final walk, so did the country he never stopped serving. Could this legacy inspire a nation's gratitude? In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.